Thanks for joining me on episode 957 of the Inspired Stewardship Podcast.
Hey, I'm Nick Pavlidis from the Confessions of a Terrible Husband podcast. I challenge you to not be a terrible husband or wife or friend like me by being intentional about stewarding your relationships. One way to be inspired to be a better husband is to listen to this, the Inspired Stewardship Podcast with my friend, Scott Mater.
We really should not be wasting our time and our energy because it's not ours. It's gifted to us by God. That's what stewardship means. And then it says is working for the Lord, not for human masters. Keeping God in mind for our motivation for all that we do.
Welcome and thank you for joining us on the Inspired Stewardship Podcast. If you truly desire to become the person who God wants you to be, then you must learn to use your time, your talent, and your treasures for your true calling. In the Inspired Stewardship Podcast, you will learn to invest in yourself, invest in others, and develop your influence so that you can impact the world.
In today's Spiritual Foundation episode about investing in yourself, I talk with you about Colossians chapter 3, verse 23. I share some of the context and meaning behind this passage, and I also share why this is a powerful verse for all people. So on Monday's episode yesterday, Roy talked a little bit about how this is one of his life passages. And you'll hear various translations of it, but basically it says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. Colossians chapter 3, verse 23. Now, the context of this passage was actually about bond servants who were serving their earthly masters. If you go back and you read before and after what's coming in this part of this book, it's clear that this is talking in the context of bond servants. Now, in the Roman world, bond servants had no rights. They had no justice. They just basically had to work because the Lord told them to. The Lord, in this case, though, being their master here on earth. And what this is talking about is actually going about all of your work with all of your heart, even though you have no rights, even though you have no justice, simply because of the fear and the loyalty and the character of God. It's not for the earthly people that you labor, it's for God, the ultimate master. So if this is the way that a bondservant, a slave basically, someone who had no rights is supposed to think about the work that they do, then think about how those of us that have freedom and independence and maybe our own jobs and these sorts of things should actually be thinking about the work that we do. Whether it's work that we do for a boss, for a client, for a customer, for our family, for a volunteer organization that we work with, whatever we do should be done as an act of worship unto the Lord. If God created us in his image and called for us to be productive, among many other things, God calls for us to be creative and productive and to work, and that doing these things would glorify God if we're doing it for God's sake and doing it to the best of our abilities. God intends that we would create value on earth because God has delegated to us our work. It is an act of sacrifice and service and obedience to actually work in that way. If you think about this passage, it says, whatever you do. It doesn't say only when you're doing the work that you like. It doesn't say only whenever you're doing work that you're paid for. It doesn't say anything. It says whatever you do. All the work that we do should be done for the glory of God. And that would actually include even really anything that we do, rest, relaxation, anything that we do at all should be done in some sort of service or community or some sort of recognition of the glory of God. And then it says, work with all of your heart. In other words, if it's worth doing well. It's worth doing with excellence. It's worth doing right. We really should not be wasting our time and our energy because it's not ours. It's gifted to us by God. That's what stewardship means. And then it says is working for the Lord, not for human masters, keeping God in mind for our motivation for all that we do. It's not that we don't pay attention to what our boss wants or our client wants. It's not that we don't look at those that have feedback or energy or input into us. It's not that we ignore what people say and do. It's that we recognize that those folks have authority over us only as it is given to them by God, and that we need to make sure that God has the ultimate authority. And at the end of the day, even if they want us to cut corners, even if they want us to take the easy way out, we should step up and do what we're asked to do by God. That's why this is such a powerful verse, because it tells you that everything you do has value, but it also tells you that everything you do, you have to step up and deliver on that value, because that is what God has asked us to do. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much for listening to the Inspired Stewardship Podcast. As a subscriber and listener, we challenge you to not just sit back and passively listen, but act on what you've heard and find a way to live your calling. If you enjoyed this episode, do me a favor. Go over to facebook.com/inspired stewardship and like our Facebook page and mark it that you'd like to get notifications from us so that we can connect with you on Facebook and make sure that we're serving you to the best of our abilities with time and tips there. Until next time, invest your time, your talent, and your treasures. Develop your influence and impact the world.